Joining us today on the Daily Dose, I have someone joining us today that I'm very excited to talk to because I have someone that knows sports, but they know sports from a different perspective. Lee Povey is a former international coach. Lee has been involved in a number of Olympic-type athletes, got a ton of sports experience at every level from youth, like I said, clear to the Olympics. He is a co-founder of a company called Coach's Soul, a leadership development coaching company for sports coaches. At Coach's Soul, they believe that the relationship between coaches and athletes is going to just grow and grow and grow, and I could not agree more. I have got a lot of questions for you, Lee. But before we drill down on what it is that you do, Lee, first off, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. Really appreciate it. And I'm now considering hiring you as my hype man after that entrance speech to just follow me around and keep me motivated every day. Love it.
Well, sure. We've got to hype you up. You're doing really good work. Lee, tell me a little bit about your athletic background, you personally, before you got into the coaching side of things. What about you? What were you doing athletically?
Yeah, I've got a little bit of an interesting way of getting into it. So very sporty, like many of us. I was a district swimming champion. My dad was a cyclist, so I discovered track cycling. We got a velodrome in Brighton, not a particularly good one, but there is one there. So I started racing when I was 13 years old. Realized I was a sprinter. So we're talking short distance events of a minute and under, which is unusual for cycling. Cycling's mainly an endurance sport. So I was already a little bit of an outlier by doing something a bit different there. Got to a national level, got invited onto the GB team. This was the time when there was no funding for the GB program. That changed hugely later on, but at that time there was no funding, no support, and it didn't seem that I'd be able to have a career. I wasn't exceptionally gifted. I was good, but I wasn't going to go and win the Olympic Games. So did that. Realized that it wasn't going to be a career for me, went into the corporate world, went into real estate, worked for a large corporate company for 5 years and opened my own one for 6 years. Still kept in touch with cycling, still did it for fun, still raced at kind of a low level locally, and realized that, I just loved it and I wasn't enjoying being a salesperson. I wasn't enjoying having my own company selling property. So sold my company, and got back into sports coaching, and also then started competing as a masters rider. So that's 35 up. Had some reasonable success there. Discovered that I had a talent for coaching. The first 3 athletes I coached all became national champions and got onto the national team back in the UK. And this is when there was now a bunch of funding. Some of those athletes have gone on to win medals at Olympic Games and win win world championships. And just had this different experience coming into it because I didn't go straight from being an athlete to a coach. I had that 11, 12-year period where I worked in the corporate world in between and then came back to training myself. And the desire for me to be a good athlete as an older athlete meant that I really started studying psychology and physiology at a level beyond I'd ever done that before. And humbling, if you've ever done that, to realize once you start studying these things, how much more there is to know. So I got a quick reminder of how broad that system is. But the advantage I'd had as a coach is that I'd had leadership training and I'd done a lot of leadership work in my corporate day. So I came into it a bit different from most coaches come into it, where they go that immediate route from athlete to coach.
Lee, did you have, and I usually ask people that end up going to coaching the same question. Did you have a coach that you looked at and said, that's the person that either changed kind of the way I was going, or the other side, and I'll be very honest, I was on this side, I didn't have a coach. And so I looked and said, I want to go into coaching because I never had that in my life. What was your story?
Yeah, great question. I kind of had both, but slightly different. So my first proper coach was the director of coaching for British Cycling at the time. And unfortunately, he just wasn't a good coach. He didn't understand sprinting, so kept trying to give me endurance coaching. So I'm doing 3-hour road rides, training for an event that lasts 1 minute. As we know now, that's not good preparation. And he went to the Junior World Championships the year before I was due to go, came back and said, the East Germans, the Russians, the Italians are too good. No British rider will ever win a World Championships. Well, the British team is now, and has been for the last 3 Olympic cycles, the most successful team in track cycling. So clearly he was wrong. You know, there is no nation in the world that has genetically better human beings than another nation. It's just about the preparation and the program. So that was my first experience. I had this really negative coach, didn't understand me, didn't understand the sport we were training for, and was very negative about our ability to do that sport. Then when I came back in as a masters rider, and I'd met this guy before, a guy called David Legrais, when I was younger, just as I was finishing my coach cycling career as a young athlete, I came across him and found him very inspirational. This guy was just really, really good, different, looked at things in a different way, quite avant-garde. And then I employed him as a coach when I came back as a masters rider to start coaching me. And it was a completely different coaching experience. He really understood sprinters. He really understood the event that we were training for. And as a new experience to me, he understood the psychology of the event and what we were training for. And I just had this wonderful experience with him. And he taught me a lot about how to coach, and a lot that I still use even in the corporate world. And we're still very good friends today. So I had both. I had that really bad coach that kind of made me want to understand the sport better myself, so I could train myself. So I learned self-sufficiency by having that bad coach in. And then I had this great role model that really taught me how to coach and what being a coach meant, and the level that we should be at when we're coaching other human beings, and the responsibility that we have as coaches, not just for the physical welfare of our athletes, but for the emotional welfare as well.
Lee, you bring up such great points, because coaching there's so many facets to it. And you have so many coaches that say, I just need X's and O's. I just need to learn the sport. You have other coaches that may say, no, I just need to learn the motivation, the psychology. It really takes both to be effective. If you have one without the other, you might be okay. You will never achieve what you truly can achieve. If you can learn both, you give a great example of someone that finally brought both, and oh, wow, this is so different. Because as athletes, we all want the same thing. We want to get better at our sport, don't we?
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, too many coaches worry too much about the physiology and some degree the technique, although technique is obviously very important,
Sure.
and not enough about the emotional part of it. And also just their own skill set. So that's their leadership skill set and their communication skill set. And because of that, even if they have the technical ability and the physiological knowledge, they often can't share it, or they can't generate trust because their communication style doesn't generate trust. So even if they're given really good advice, their athletes don't necessarily fully trust them. Example I can give is, one way to really generate trust with athletes is when they ask you a question you don't know the answer to, don't make something up. And I see that happen a lot with coaches. And it's something that athletes will come and talk to me about for advice, where they'll go, hey, I asked my coach about this, and I know they just made the answer up, instead of saying, I don't know the answer. So, when I work with coaches with things like that, great leadership is saying, I don't know the answer to that question. Let me go and investigate it. Let me find somebody else who might know the answer. And while I'm doing that, why don't you do your own research as well? Especially if you're dealing with more mature athletes, make them a partnership. The days of coaches being the authority and what they say goes is gone. Athletes have way more power now. And we see where governing bodies are giving athletes more power and giving athletes more responsibility. And we have things like safe sport to protect athletes. That's missing for coaches. We don't support coaches in that way, sadly. Working for a governing body, I just didn't get that kind of support, training, mentoring that I was desperate to have. And Miriam had a very similar, my partner in coaches, so had a very similar experience herself. And that's a main reason that we've created this company and this program, is because we see so many isolated, lonely, burnt out coaches, and they just don't know where to get the support. So it's part leadership training, it's part communication skills, it's part knowing your own emotional story and your own emotional stuff that gets in the way of you turning up as the best version of yourself, and will help you work past that and move on from that. And then it's part just being that support network that we all deserve, and we're now giving to elite athletes. They have sports psychologists, coaches are more aware how to deal with them, the governing bodies are more aware how to deal with them, yet we're forgetting actually the person that has the most emotional load to carry, which is the coach.
Wow, Lee, you bring up so many good points there. You can't see me. I'm sitting here nodding my head at everything you're saying, because so much of what you're saying is just so accurate. There is a perception right now, I think, with coaches that it's motivation. It's maybe, like you said, just focusing on the event itself, focusing on the sport itself. I understand it. I just don't always agree with it, because if you want to look at the difference between a successful athlete, a successful team, like you said, so much of it is about leadership, and it is about trust. And if you can get that trust as a coach, if you can get those athletes to buy into what you're doing, you're going to have way more success. If you can't, you're going to be sitting there wondering why everything splintered and went so many different ways, and everybody's on their own agenda. You bring up a ton of great points that myself as a former coach, I look back and say, oh, wow, you just could not be more right. So you go into the coaching side, and you obviously saw a need to help other coaches. I cannot agree more, but was there something specific that you saw that you said, man, coaches just, they need help? A lot of times you've got a coach coaching, say a football team out wherever. They don't always have someone to go to as a mentor to say, how do I get better at this job? Did you, I'm assuming you recognized that need and said, hey, we need to address this.
Yeah, I mean, from my own experience. So as I grew up the coaching tree, and then I developed a program for USA Cycling, because they didn't have a program for finding and nurturing sprint talent towards the Olympics. I developed this program, and I was looking for ways to be better. So I'm reading leadership books. I'm tapping back into the stuff I've done in the corporate world. I'm reaching out to physiologists and engineers and aerodynamists and upskilling myself. And I realized it just gets really lonely. There's not many people to talk about the sport with. And then, when it starts to get stressful, I changed the way that we looked at, or I was aiming at changing the way we looked at sprint cycling in this country. The US has been struggling to be effective in track sprint cycling. Our last major win was the Olympics in 2000. We won one world championship, one female world championship in 2008. So that's 22 years without a male winning a world championship or even medaling at a world championship. We had one female that got the win in 2008, and that's it. So I really wanted to change the way we were doing it, and all I encountered was resistance. And I'm trying to figure out why. I'm like, is it me? Is there something I'm doing wrong? And I realized it wasn't. It's just fear. And a lot of coaches sit in fear, and a lot of sports people sit in fear. A lot of athletes sit in fear of, well, if I change something, I'm going to lose all of my ability, and suddenly I won't be able to play anymore. I won't be able to do my sport, or our team is going to fail. And what I ended up doing was befriending national team coaches in other countries. The people that would actually be my rivals were the people that were most supportive to me. And that just shocked me. And then we started talking, and I realized they're all going through the same thing that I'm going through. There's not many people for them to talk to. There's not many people for them to talk to about their sport. The coaches kind of lower down didn't necessarily understand the level that we want to talk about the sport at. And that's not their fault. There's no training for them. And sometimes they don't, especially in sport, they don't want to be collaborative because they're worried that you might find out what they know or don't know. So you've got fear in the coaches, and you've got, where do I go and get support? Most coaches, or lots of coaches, are really stressed. As we know, athletes get paid more, they get more support, coaches get paid less, especially in Olympic sports. The hours are long, and there's nobody to support you. So having had that experience myself, and then just by chance, I met Miriam, who runs a company called Athlete Soul, where she helps athletes transition after sport. We got talking, realized we had very similar experiences, and we thought, well, how can we actually help these coaches instead of just letting this thing continue where coaches get burnt out? Their careers are quite short. Something that really should be a career you can do for 30, 40, 50 years. Lots of elite coaches quit after 5 years. So we were trying to find a way to support them, and we came up with this program of individual and group coaching taken straight from the corporate world, exactly what I do with companies. So I've been doing this work with companies for the last few years. It's the same stuff. Being a leader in a company is very similar to being a sports coach. The skill set has a huge crossover. You're trying to do the same thing, which is empower those people around you to be the best versions of themselves, both individually and then as a collective, so that the team can do the best it can.
Lee, coaching currently, at least to me, feels like we might be at, I know every generation says it, we might be at the most challenging point that I could remember for a number of different reasons, from parent involvement to, kids have their own agendas. They see, if I go do this, I can make a name for myself, forget teammates, forget coaches. What challenges do you see coaches having right now, having to deal with so many things that have nothing to do with their sport, but they've got so many challenges, like you talked about, no support, lack of funding. The money is never as good for the coaches, but there's just so many problems that coaches do face. And like you said, it ends up leading to a short life because they don't last in coaching. But what problems are you seeing in this era right now?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said there. And there's a bit of a differentiation. Like there's a difference between your Steve Kerr NBA coaches and then, the majority of coaches, which are working either at a lower level in those professional sports or are working in Olympic sports and amateur sports where they don't have the backing, they don't have the money. You'd be surprised how poorly paid Olympic coaches get in this country. It's not most of these Olympic sports are not well funded. So we see loneliness, we see burnout, we see fear of losing their job, fear of not knowing how to support their athletes, overwhelm from all that they're being asked to do without having the skill sets, without having the training, without having that emotional support. I work with these companies and I'm coaching the leaders of the companies and the executive teams and doing workshops. And then I also work with sports coaches, and they're desperate to have that kind of stuff. And often there's just not the budget for it, or even the desire. Their own administrators, their program directors just expect you to go from being an elite athlete to a coach. And they're completely different skill sets. Elite athlete is a very selfish profession. As you said, even in team sports, a lot of these athletes are like, right, how do I get my own stats up? How do I get my own value up so that for my contract renewal, I have all of this great data? And that's why I'm always so impressed with the likes of Stephen Curry that absolutely put the team first. And I think that's a big reason why the Warriors have done as well as they've done. And that's led by the culture of the coaches. So you make those athletes really feel like they're part of something, they're more able to sacrifice their own individual goals for the greater good. But just supporting these coaches, as you say, there's so much pressure on them. For social media, they get so much more exposed. The athletes have so much more of a voice, which is great. I'm not saying that's wrong. I really support that, yet that puts extra load on the coaches. So yeah, it's really difficult being a coach right now. As you said, we always think that this is the most difficult time. I don't think there's ever been such a challenging time to be a professional sports coach as there is right now. And we're here to help, right? There is ways of helping you. There's ways of helping you look after yourself. It's always interesting to see how many coaches are out of shape themselves physically. Even when lots of them were ex-athletes, how they've just let go of their own physicality and how that affects them and how that hurts them. We know burnout, so stress, burnout gets both physically and emotionally released in the body. For you to release your stress levels, you have to do some kind of low-level physical activity, even if it's just a walk outside, which is why, guess what? During COVID, everybody started walking without realizing it. It was to release their stress levels. So it's helping coaches look at themselves holistically. So not just, how do you work better technically? We actually try to avoid that. We're looking at how does the coach look after themselves? And then how do they best communicate and work with their team and therefore allow themselves to feel more confident, less stressed, know that they've just got somebody on their side who actually understands what they're going through. Even that alone is incredibly powerful.
Lee, so you and Miriam build this company called Coach's Soul. Tell me what Coach's Soul actually does.
Yeah, we do three things. We try to keep it very simple. So the first thing is one-to-one coaching. So that is you sit with me or one of the other coaches. These are 50-minute sessions. You talk about what's coming up for you as an individual, what you'd like to work on to be a better coach and a better leader. We unpack and uncover the emotional stuff that's getting in the way of you doing that. So we do some stuff called essence work and survival mechanism, which has been really pivotal in my own life. So that's establishing who you are and how you show up as the best version of yourself. And then our survival mechanism is that armor that we've put on as, we walk through a family system, our schooling, our first jobs, and we put this armor on to protect ourselves from the world because as children, we're vulnerable. And then when we become an adult, that armor can often get in the way. And we put a name to the survival mechanism. So mine is tyrannical Einstein. So if I get triggered, I become a tyrant. And you know what? Being a tyrant is not a good skill set for a leader or a sports coach. So,
right.
I work on that and I'm aware of that. And I've now got to the point where I'm very rarely the tyrant. My work currently is my fear of being the tyrant can get in the way sometimes. So being afraid of what I can turn into gets in the way. And that's where I'm working with my own personal coach. So we do that one-to-one work. And, we work on things, as I said, like communication skills. You said earlier, what's something I see coaches do wrong? It's how they communicate with their athletes, especially when they give feedback. In high performance environments, we tend to give a lot of critical feedback and not enough appreciative feedback. Every study shows that the more critical feedback you give without giving appreciative feedback, people just can't hear your feedback. So you're telling them stuff and they go, here's that coach again, having a go at me, F him, I'm not interested in this. And they literally can't absorb the wisdom you're trying to give them. So we work on that skill set of how you look for the good, not just look for the gains. And the way you do it, I completely changed how I give feedback. I ask permission. It sounds such a silly thing and such a small thing, but if you ask somebody for permission, hey, are you open to some feedback on what I've just seen? Or, can we explore what happened in that game? You open to some feedback. And then you ask them first what they thought. They're then going to tell you where they're at because you're going to get an understanding of their understanding. And then instead of piling on and pointing out the same things that they've seen, you can agree with them, but you're not coming in and saying everything they already know about themselves. You then look for some other gain areas and you also look for some areas to appreciate them. That person is going to start coming back to you and be hungry for feedback rather than avoiding you because they don't want the feedback because it hurts. There's only so much critical feedback we can get before we start shutting down. Watching coaches learn that skill, changing the way that they give feedback is incredibly impactful. They just suddenly start enjoying their job again. Because instead of going, oh, I've got to tell the team again how they're not doing well and how they're failing, they go, I actually get to tell the team how they're doing really well. And then we get to look at the gain areas too. We can do both of those. And then the two other offerings we have is peer groups. We've got a new one coming in January. This is similar kind of stuff, but we're doing it in a group. And it's so powerful to sit down with a group of your peers and these people listen to you. And you watch as somebody sits there and shares the struggles they're going through. And then the rest of the group put their hand up and say, I understand. I've had a similar situation. And people realize they're not alone. That's incredibly powerful. And we do a lot of teaching in those groups as well, kind of emotional models, how to help them communicate and lead. And then the last one is we get you to video yourself coaching and we give you feedback on you actually coaching. It's probably our toughest offering from the point of view it's incredibly vulnerable to be videoed being coached. I've experienced it as a sports coach and as a leadership coach. So I work with a coach right now, and my one-to-one and group calls, I video one of those a month and they get reviewed. And it's tough getting reviewed on how you're showing up with your work. It's also probably the fastest way to really improve your craft, to actually have somebody else really look at you and give you that direct feedback about how you're showing up, how you're physically carrying yourself, the words that you use, and looking at the impact that you're having on your athletes that you're not necessarily aware of. So that's our 3 offerings: the video coaching, the group offering, and then the one-to-one. And I'm working with people on all 3, and it's making a difference. And to me, I'm very, very passionate about allowing coaches to enjoy what they do so that the athletes can have a great experience. And coaches have such an impact, especially coaches working with young people. They have a huge impact on that young person's life. And from having had my own negative experience as a young athlete and watching other athletes, young athletes, have negative experiences, I want to change that. And the majority of it is not because those coaches are horrible people or they're mean to cause harm. It's because they just don't know how to do it better.
Oh, you could not be more right. You are so right on everything you're saying. I say the same thing all the time. Even, as my kids went through athletics and I'm watching from a distance, I'm saying the same thing. It's not that the coach is a bad coach, is a bad person. They just don't know. And I find, and maybe you found this as well, there are so many coaches that don't think to go get help themselves. There are so many coaches that go, well, I'm the coach. The kids have to go improve. I already know what I'm doing. Coaches, I'm telling you, if you're listening, you've got to go find something like this. You've got to go find this website, because it's just going to make your job easier. And that's the part sometimes that coaches don't always grasp. It's going to make what you do so much better. It's going to make it so much more impactful. And it's going to, in the end, it's going to make your job easier because you're doing the work more efficiently. It's working better. You're making more of an impact on the kids or the athletes that you're training. You're hitting a number of great points there. Lee, you say in your kind of mantra for your company, for Coach's Soul, that you believe the relationship between coaches and athletes is going to get deeper in the future. I couldn't agree more. I think it can get deeper. Why do you believe that it will?
Because I believe that coach is going to be able to go to that level.
Yeah.
I remember I remember when I used to do some work with British Cycling. I was a guest coach for them, so I was a tactics and technician coach that would come to their what they called Olympic development camps. And I had close relationships with those young athletes because I thought that was important. That's an important part of being a mentor. And I remember one of the coaches saying to me, "Oh, don't get too close to the athletes." And I was like, "Well, why?" And they said, "Well, make it difficult for you to make important decisions." And I completely disagree with that. I think it's actually up to us as coaches to learn how to be able to separate those things skillfully so that we can show up well for our athletes and make difficult decisions. Me and Miriam did a group for a bunch of Australian rules football coaches. I don't know if you know that sport, but it's the biggest sport in Australia. It's kind of similar to what the NFL is here.
Right.
And I sat there with these 4 guys, and they're all ex-players. They're big, manly guys. I mean, you can't see me. I'm 6'1". I'm 200 pounds. I'm not your typical psychotherapist kind of guy. I'm a blokey bloke. So it allows me to disarm those kind of guys, right? They're not looking at me. I don't have long hair and a ponytail. So they're not looking at me going, "Who is this weirdo?" They're looking at me going, "Oh, he looks like one of us." And yet, even those guys, we do a check-in at the beginning of the meeting. And I said, "How are you feeling?" Every single one of them checked in with fear, because they've never sat down in a group of men and really talked about what was challenging for them.
Yeah.
Because as men, we're taught not to be weak, not to show weakness. The classic "don't be," whatever that means.
Right.
So, I'm sitting with these guys, and they're talking about the relationships they want to have with their teams and their athletes and what they want to create. And they're just worried about upsetting people. One of the biggest fears for them was around athlete selection. And it's knowing that you can make those difficult choices, but you can do them from heart and from love, and the athletes will understand it. And even if they don't understand it immediately, they'll eventually understand it.
So Lee, I've got to ask you, you are focused on sports. You will work with coaches. You will help them in a one-on-one setting. You'll help them in a peer setting. You'll even watch video of them doing their job and then kind of address what you see, address some of maybe the problems, maybe the good things, maybe the bad things, whatever it might be. Do you do this specifically only in sports? Businesses come to you, hey, can you watch the board meeting and see our general manager speaking? Do you do the business side, or do you stick with just sports only?
I know I mainly do the business side. So for the last 3.5 years now, just before COVID, I went from being a national team coach to being an executive coach, working with companies.
Okay.
And, doing that made me realize how much we neglect sports coaches. So 75% of my business is working with companies. And I do exactly what we're talking about. I join meetings, I do workshops, I do one-on-one coaching. I'll watch them present, and then we'll coach on their presenting and how they're showing up as leaders. And that's how I know this work is both incredibly powerful and challenging. And, these people would describe me as somebody that calls the ball in the most loving way possible, Clint. I'm there to support you in being the best version of yourself. I can't do it for you. It's not my job to tell you how to do it. It's my job to expose how you are doing it and then make you aware of what you're capable of doing. I just, even in myself, I've had therapy. I've been in men's groups. I now have my own coach. In fact, I have two coaches. I have a personal coach and then a coach, as I said, that watches the videos of me working. And it's allowing me to take my own work to a completely different level. I wish I knew this stuff when I was a sports coach. I mean, I knew some of it, but not as much as I know now. And I want to give that gift back to sports coaches. I was working with a coach during the Tokyo Olympics. And what we did is we set up a 15-minute check-in every day that he was at the Olympics. And he was working with, I won't give away what sport, but he was working with a team that ended up winning 3 gold medals and a silver medal. And there was individual athletes, but their nation. And what he wanted to get out of that 15-minute check-in with me was to set himself up to enjoy his Olympic experience, because he'd seen so many coaches take it almost so seriously that they didn't actually enjoy it. They were going to the Olympics, which is a coach, in Olympic sports, that's the pinnacle of what you're ever going to do as a coach. It's the Super Bowl of athletics or Olympic sports, and half the coaches weren't enjoying it because it was so stressful. So what he wanted to do was check in with me, unload any of the emotional baggage from the previous day or the fears that he had for that day, and then set the intention that he was going to go and enjoy it. And he trusted his athletes were ready. They'd done the work. They'd done everything they needed to do. It's quite funny, actually. You would think an Olympics competition is a lot of pressure, which it is. It's also one of the least attended competitions. When you go to a World Championships, there's 3 or 4 times as many athletes there is at Olympic, because the Olympics is so select.
That's true.
So it's actually, it's based over more days. The competition's based over more days. So it's actually a less pressured environment time-wise than a World Championships is. So you can go to that Olympics and you're not rushing around, and you've got less athletes to deal with. And if you can get yourself in the right headspace, you can really enjoy it. And he did. And he came out of that Olympics, even during COVID, which was stressful enough, obviously, in itself, and said that he'd reached his main goal, which was obviously not just to allow his athletes to perform at their best, but it was to enjoy the experience himself as a coach. And that's another part of what we want to do here. Is it's not just helping you with your skill sets. It's, I want you to love your work. And I feel really passionate about that. I really feel really passionate about helping people love what they do, rather than seeing it as, I have to do this thing, and believe in that grind that, coaching is meant to be stressful. No, it's not. There may be stressful periods, but it's not meant to be stressful. It's meant to be enjoyable.
I am just absolutely fascinated by what it is that you're doing. I know that as a young coach, there were so many times that I was looking for someone or something to grab onto and say, oh, how can I figure this out? How can I get better at it? I want to improve. I want to become a better coach, but there's only so many resources. I kind of did what you did. I went and grabbed every book I could get. I went and found every video I could find. I'd go to coaches, clinics, and camps, but someone to help you, almost mentor you and say, hey, let's look at specifically what you're doing. I'm not just going to give you something broad. Here's a coaching principle. No, I'm going to give it specifically to what suits you and what you do well and maybe what you struggle with. That to me is an absolutely fascinating aspect to this. I really, really appreciate what you're doing. What is the best way to contact your group? What is the best way to find you, to have some contact with you and your company and what it is that you do?
Yeah, thank you very much, Clint. I am, as I said, very passionate about this work. Me and Miriam have experienced what it's like to be that isolated, burnt out, lonely coach, and I don't want anyone else to experience that anymore. I have lofty aims. I want to work with thousands of coaches and really change coaching for coaches and athletes. So yeah, come find us, coachessoul.com on the internet. Same handle on Instagram and Facebook. So that's coachessoul.com on Instagram. I'm Lee Povey. You'll find me Googling me on the internet. Reach out to me. I'd love to speak to you. You don't have to struggle anymore. And there's a version of you that is happier and wins more, and your team wins more, and your athletes wins more, without being quite as stressed as you are now. In fact, probably being a lot less stressed than you are now. That all exists, and we will help you unlock that.
Lee, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the Daily Dose as someone who's passionate about coaching, passionate about coaches, and getting the athletes better coaching, which I honestly, I look at right now and I feel, you want to talk about a pandemic. I feel like there's a pandemic of good coaches right now. There are not enough people out there that honestly know how to coach kids the right way, to give them the tools that they need to be successful. And like we spoke about earlier, where you were saying, it's not that they're bad people. They're not. They just need to find ways to improve. And going to coachessoul.com is going to be your way to improve. I cannot thank you enough for stopping by the Daily Dose today, talking about what you do, talking about coaching in general. Please know you are welcome back anytime. I would love to sit and talk with you, talk with Miriam about what it is that you're doing. It is absolutely fascinating to me.
Thank you very much for having us, Clint. I really appreciate it. And can I thank you for being a great interviewer? Awesome questions.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And hey, let's do this again sometime. I would love to check back in with you and kind of see how things are going, but know that you are welcome anytime.
Thank you, buddy.